Hello and welcome. This is Down to Astro, an astrology podcast where we look at what is happening in the sky right now, what has just happened, and what is also occurring here on Earth. I'm Chani Nicholas.
I'm Thea Anderson.
And I'm Eliza Robertson.
And in this episode, we wanted to look at like a bigger context of what was occurring. I was having conversations with folks that were in their 70s. And I kept hearing the sentiment that this is a time that was reminding them of the late 60s, that this was something that looked like a kind of mirror image of the anti-war movements of that time. And so the three of us were talking and I was like, that's interesting. I wonder if there are any astrological parallels. Because when I think of that time, I don't know about the two of you, but probably from Rick Tarnas's, seminal book, Cosmos and Psyche, I think a lot about Uranus and Pluto and the conjunction that they were making and stuff that was kind of setting that off. And we didn't obviously see parallels with those two planets, but Eliza started pulling up charts and we found a kind of plethora of mirror images of that time. And so we're going to talk about like the overarching kind of structural similarities that are happening this year and next to what were happening over the course of the later part of the 60s. And then we're also going to take a couple of individual kind of pieces of that, aspects of that. Eliza's going to talk about some other kind of aspects that were happening then and now, and just like kind of peruse around that, because in part, this moment is so, tremendously painful. And there's every day we see so much like violence and human degradation and humiliation and genocide happening, that we can talk about all the ways in which the astrology of the moment is kind of speaking to that, reflecting that. But I also wanted to give us another kind of framework and maybe something else to look at so that there might also be some hope, and maybe even looking at what went wrong in that movement or things that were kind of missed opportunities, and how we can think of this time in a longer kind of context. Like obviously we need we need a million things to enter Gaza right now. We need aid. We need obviously an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We need things we probably don't even know are needed. And then I think I'm always thinking about long-term, like how do we shift things long-term? What worked in the past, what didn't? Okay, I just said a lot. The two of you want to add any context to any of that before we kind of get into some more specifics?
Well, when you raised the idea of this time period mirroring the 60s, I think like the context with which you were speaking was partly in terms of anti-war movements, right? It was like this sense of foment in the air, or the sense of resistance in the air, and people people in the streets rallying for peace in such a way that perhaps we have seen since the anti-Vietnam War protests. But I think what you're pointing to is a lot of elders who were, active in those years, they were noticing parallels. So that kind of made these parallels all the more striking. And what I started noticing to that point, as you mentioned this and as it was on my mind, was like, not only are there these mirroring events with regards to anti-war protests, but also this is the first time that I can remember since the Cold War. I was 2 when the Cold War ended, but it's the first time that I can remember in my lifetime, which partially straddles when the Cold War ended, that we're talking about Russia. And by we, I mean mainstream media, and also like pointing to this space race and this arms race, and the ways in which we have these competing powers trying to essentially like flex their muscles, and this sort of wild space imperialism and military complex, which is severely worrying on so many levels. But that was another echo that I started to notice, which we can get into. And then Thea, I know that you were noticing some other echoes as well, which feel really important to bring in to the conversation.
Yeah, I think so much of what we're looking at now too is like the way it's recalling history, but like Chani, really interested in you saying like what went wrong or like what can we pick up, and that it's kind of rhyming with a lot of what I'm mapping to. Well, we'll get to the nodes, and the North Node in Aries and the South Node in Libra, and a lot of how we deal with civil rights and what they are, because that is a hallmark of the 60s, is like that we had to reckon with the history of this country and a vision for what we wanted the country to reflect. So this country, we're recording in the United States, this is where we're located. And to think about how that's coming up, I'm thinking about the rights that we took for granted that are now sort of seeping out. So yeah, I have a lot to say on that regard for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's start maybe with some of the astrological similarities that we see at the end of the 60s and now. And one of them, as Thea mentioned, that was really striking is that the North and South nodes were going through at the later part of the 60s the same signs as they're going through now. So back in October of 2023, on the 14th of October, we had our first eclipse in Libra near the South Node. Of course, that was 7 days after October 7th. So I astrologically link that pretty closely to and what happened and what's been happening. And we're about to, on March 25th, have the second eclipse in Libra near the South Node. So for astrologers, we really look at these two little pockets in the year. That's almost like a corner that we turn during eclipse season. And so if that's what happened in October of 2023, then on one level, we're looking at like, okay, what's happening now that's commenting on that? This is like the second chapter in this book. But then because we were talking about the 60s, we look back and we were like, oh, wow, the nodes were in the same position, again, in the later years. But I don't have the years at the top of mind, 67, 68.
67 to 69.
The North, 67 to 69. So the North Node was in Aries and the South Node was in Libra, which is important because if you look historically at eclipses and world events, they often correlate. And what often happens is we collectively start speaking about or living out some kind of archetypal experience that are related to the signs that the eclipses will occur in, that the nodes are in. So to have the South Node in Libra is saying something poignant about justice and fairness and equity and balance and harmony and the lack thereof. And to have the North Node in Aries is saying something honestly about war, because it's a point of being amped up, and Aries is a sign that's ruled by Mars. And so we do relate it to aggression and to retaliation and to hostility and violence and war, also to courage and valor and the individual and energy and emergence and a lot of really great things. But because we're looking at literal anti-war movements and having these two signs that are about war and peace be so activated by the eclipses that happen there, both now and then, all of us thought was very kind of like startling.
I think the only thing I would add is just that the reason why the nodes specifically of all the points and planets we can look at are striking is because they do bring these like pulses of energy with eclipse season. So they bring these like power charged fateful days, and that can include the days leading up to and around the eclipses, which we saw with the October 14th eclipse being preceded by by October 7th. And so it's almost like the changes that are happening on a much slower level with the slower moving planets, which we can speak to also in a moment. Those are like the wheels are in motion and they're turning, but they're turning at the rate of those planets, which can take, in the case of planets like Neptune, 14 years to move through a sign. Pluto, like 12 to 20 years to move through a sign. Uranus, 7 years. So we're talking very slow cycles. And then when we have eclipses, it's like it just brings this injection of urgency and an injection of change that really shakes us up and gets us in a more reactive state, which, I mean, there are many, I don't want to wrap that up and oversimplify it. I just think it can prompt responsiveness where before we were just kind of letting things unfold.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's certainly like a quickening moment. And it, like, I think of like now this thing is about to be ushered in that kind of like catalyst kind of way, like that eclipse energy can bring. And I'm thinking now, standing in this moment and about to enter the first south node lunar eclipse in Libra, and then the north node solar eclipse on April 8th. And what strikes me about the April 8th eclipse is that it really, I think, to your point, Eliza, before about U.S. imperialism, and we're talking about sort of the way that it hits the path of totality, it'll be visible in the United States. So people are calling this, the next great American eclipse. And you can see that in the way that, because first of all, we had one about in 2017, so 4 years ago, we had it also in another fire sign, and I think of Leo. So then to have it in Aries, both of these have to do with leadership, positioning, and then of course Aries has like the sort of war element to it. And I wonder what about the US, we know the complicity, we know the role that's been played with the war in Gaza. Like how is the US going to be eclipsed? We're in an election year. People are putting pressure on Biden, on our leader, our current leader, who is going to be the next leader. What will he do now that will impact the election come the fall? Those are the kind of things that I'm mapping towards based on what's echoing in the past. It just feels so poignant in this moment.
That's such a great point. So I just want to kind of tease that out a little bit. So Thea's talking about that. I think you'll remember the Great American Eclipse that happened. Pretty sure it happened at 29 degrees of Leo. It happened on Trump's ascendant, as we think of it. And the shadow fell across America. And within 2 weeks of that eclipse, Charlottesville happened, which is certainly not the most egregious thing that's ever happened in the past, like 4 or 5, whatever years in this country. But I've always felt like it was such a signaling of what was coming, of what was happening, of what was in the shadows, and then was all of a sudden brazenly paraded out, which is white nationalism and white supremacy. So that was, the literal shadow that Trump also helps to expose across the country. We can look at it at a lot of different ways. Trump is also an eclipse baby. He was born in an eclipse, so he carries that volatile eclipsy. He eclipses energy kind of with it. And so what Thea's saying now is that this is like the second eclipse that's having, that was the one we can kind of like remember and point back to in recent history. I love that you're connecting those two, because Leo is like the sign that's related to kings and rulers. And Aries is a sign where the sun is exalted, and the sun is the planet of kings and rulers and queens and what have you. And so Thea is saying like both of these are in traditional astrology would be linked to that, and that this is another shadow being cast. And then Thea, you also told me this. I hadn't thought of it because a lot of the charts don't have Chiron in them, but it's also the United States' Chiron return right now. And that April 8th eclipse will be exactly conjunct Chiron. It's a cazimi, which is a very rare occurrence for an eclipse to happen within another, like the orb of another planet being right there. So Chiron is the planet of the wounded we call it the wounded healer. That's a very simplified kind of understanding, but it is a pain point. It is something that's gnarled and kind of stuck in our system. We can think of it as something that might need to be like adjusted or massaged out. It's something that needs to be understood. It's something that needs to be addressed. And it is also a place of great healing and medicine, but the medicine is in, I think of it as like the medicine is in addressing the wound. So all of that to say, it's time for another like go around of addressing this nation's wound with that eclipse. And then through the portal of Chiron, I want to enter into honoring the life of Aaron Bushnell. So I was really struck by obviously his act of protest. And, this is not in favor of, nor is it condemning that kind of act of protest. But just to say that it is one of the greatest sacrifice. It is the greatest sacrifice one can make. Again, I'm not condemning or upholding it. It just is. And what I thought when that happened is Chiron, the planet of the wounded healer, was crossing within 1 degree of the North Node, the place where eclipses happen. And so the North Node is a place of amplification. And if it's going to amplify something about Chiron, it's in Aries, which is the sign of the warrior. It's like we saw this former, I don't remember what part of the military he was in, but former soldier.
I think Air Force.
Can I say that? Soldier? Air Force. And it's in a fire sign. So it was just so literal the way it landed. And also not to like point to his pain and his passing as more than what's going on in Gaza or has happened in Palestine for 75 years, but that he was offering his life to point to that. And that's also what fire signs do, is they say, look at this thing. I'm going to brighten it for you to understand. And so Chiron was crossing the node where we're going to have the eclipse on April 8th. And not only that, but it was happening just before the Sun, Saturn, and Mercury were coming together in a cazimi in Pisces. And Pisces is definitely can talk to a letting go or sacrifice or something that's really altruistic. And it points to, so I was like, okay, this is striking. And then I was on somebody's TikTok, an activist's TikTok, and they were talking about how it also related to the same kind of act of protest in the 60s. And so we're getting these like mirror images again. So when we pulled up the chart for Alice Herz, we also saw that the Sun and Venus and Chiron and Saturn were in Pisces. And there was, other things happening in that chart, other things going on. And that those planets were all, especially, Chiron and Venus is oftentimes representing women. Again, Chiron, the wounded healer, were exactly square the nodes at that time. So the similarities of those two events just felt wild, because that chart is having its Saturn return. So the charts of the anti-war protests in the later parts of in the 60s are having their Saturn return, and they had their Chiron return already, and they're also having their nodal return.
Well, Thea, you're the one who noticed too, like how close it came to the last Saturn Mercury cazimi in Pisces. So, do you want to speak to what you noticed with that?
Yeah, so that was a couple weeks before the Alice Herz chart. So in our current timeline, we had the Saturn, Mercury, Sun conjunction. And there's a couple things that echo back to that time period. But when you look at that moment, that Mercury was actually in the same lineup. They didn't cazimi at the same time like we had now, but there is that kind of rhyming with that, again, that's really that sacrifice. And when I think about Pisces, that it can be that what am I willing to like surrender? I think about activism and how it's often like you have to be willing to give your life, right? That is the ultimate sacrifice. And I don't mean just like that you end it yourself or that you harm yourself in that way, but that like it is a devotion that you have to be willing to commit your life. And so that Saturn, which can signify commitments, and that the ultimate commitment would be an act of this measure. And in that moment, as you said, Chiron was there. So Chiron is still playing like a really pivotal role in both of these charts. So in 1965, Chiron was there. The Saturn, Chiron, Venus, Sun conjunction was squaring the nodes. They were actually in Sag and Gemini at the time. And they were also online with that Pluto Uranus conjunction. That was in Virgo in the late 60s. So there was a lot there that really just is echoing now. And I think when we're talking about anti-war movements, it's like that there is so much sacrifice on the part of people putting their bodies in the streets, people showing up at airports, people sacrificing. Maybe this means I get fired from this newspaper. Like there's so much sacrifice that's happening in so many different levels, and that activism is kind of taking shape in that part as well. And that's, again, not on par with what is actually happening there. But if we think about how people are showing up and where they want their voices to be heard, I think about that. Like, what does it mean to live a life, but also bring attention to the fact that there's a mass genocide going on?
Yeah, and in case the timing slipped by or wasn't highlighted enough in our conversation, it truly is striking. Like this is what the time period we're talking about. So when Alice Herz, her active process was in 1965, that was the last time that there was a Saturn cazimi around the same time as a Mercury cazimi in Pisces. So literally it was then and it was now. And as Thea pointed out, they didn't happen on exactly the same day, but it was still the same lineup in the same sign, in a sign that can really bring themes of self-sacrifice and martyrdom. And this question with any Mercury cazimi too, of like, what are we the messenger of? And what is the message that we're trying to trumpet out to other people, and what are the ways that we can do that? I found that timing so striking, and learning more about Alice Herz too. Like honestly, I was tearful as I was doing the research. She was an 82-year-old woman. She had herself escaped from Germany as a Jewish person who was leaving the Nazis, or like fleeing the Nazis essentially. So there's just so much layering in terms of like levels of protest and refusal against loss of life and genocide. And I mean, Alice Herz herself was protesting the Vietnam War, but it's just the tangles of how all of this violence and death and genocide like interweaves. It's quite gobsmacking, to be honest. Like just to withhold, or to behold is the word I'm looking for.
Right. And the resistance to it.
Yeah.
And I also thought, so the Saturn, Mercury, Sun conjunction that happened is really rare for all, for two planets to align with the sun at the same time. So that's why, astrologers were like, wow, this doesn't happen all the time. And then we were like, when was the last time this happened? And again, it's not exact, but it's a very, striking mirror image. But what happened on this one also around that time is that in Michigan, I think over 100,000 people voted uncommitted. So I thought that was also because of the war, because of the funding of the genocide, the U.S.'s funding of the genocide in Gaza. And what was striking to me is that it is about committing. And so through the act of saying I'm uncommitted, It's like a commitment to justice and a commitment to holding our leaders responsible and accountable for what they're doing. And it is not a vote for Trump to, at this point, put down on a ballot that you are uncommitted. It is a way to call on your leaders to say, you need to take this seriously because we have mass amounts of power here. And I think you want it. So I thought that was also very connected, and also, another way to be able to speak, as you said, Eliza, like that the Mercury is like, what am I speaking to? How am I committing to something here?
Well, we're talking about it, but just to name it, this is one of the most striking parallels between now and the 60s for me. It's that same period of Saturn in Pisces transitioning into Saturn in Aries, which we'll see next year in 2025. But from around, let me see if I have the dates to hand. From around, from 1964 to 1967, Saturn was in Pisces, and then 67 to 69, Saturn was in Aries. So we're living that time period now. Saturn entered Pisces March 7th, I believe, of last year, so of 2023, and it'll first enter Pisces in May of 2025. But that
enter Aries.
Sorry.
It'll first enter Aries.
Thank you. It'll first enter Aries.
No. I do it all the time.
It'll first enter Aries in May of 2025. And what I've been really sitting with that transition in the context of everything we're talking about, because first of all, Saturn in Pisces has been a transition that was so striking after like 6-ish years. 5 years of Saturn in a Saturn-ruled signs, which we all know were so crunchy in all of the ways. I don't have to spell out
Lockdown.
why the years
Lockdown.
Yeah, between 2020 and
isolation. Yeah.
There was a
Saturnian themes.
There was a lot of realities we had to face, and also just a lot of isolation and a lot of Saturn work that we did during those years. And so Saturn in Pisces in some ways has been a softening of those themes in some ways. But what it's just made me think about, when we contemplate war, my go-to planet I think about is Mars. But Mars is like the firepower of war. Mars is the immediate action of war, but who's the strategy behind it? Who's the one orchestrating the war? It's the statespeople, the decision makers. And that to me is a more Saturnian figure. And so when we're thinking about like, what is behind, if Mars is the soldier or the person putting themselves on the line one way or another, or even the protester, then the people maybe that hold the power are the ones that are in their positions for much longer. It's less of an ephemeral, like Mars changes signs typically every couple of months, whereas Saturn takes two to 3 years. So I've just been thinking about, what does it mean to have Saturn in the sign ruled by a benefic planet, by Jupiter, and what does that mean in terms of what I really want to speak to is just like the ideals actually that we're fighting for, the ideals that we're working towards peace, really having people show up at the Oscars to like stop celebrities from, walking on the red carpet, or at least to make their presence known, because there is an ideal that feels absolutely fucking urgent to uphold. And I think when we didn't have Saturn in a Jupiter ruled sign, I don't know that we felt that same urgency around around these ideals. That's the word that I keep circling around with Pisces. And I think you saw that in the mid 60s, but then when we switch into Saturn into Aries, there becomes more of like, well, we can say a lot about that, but it becomes perhaps more sharp around the edges.
Neptune is also there.
Yeah, Neptune's also there, but then Neptune's going to move into Aries with Saturn at the same time. So this Neptunian Saturnian thing is going to follow us. But I'm wondering, is there anything in the research of Saturn changing from Pisces to Aries back in the 60s that you found like, oh, that was a certain shift in? I have a theory, but I'm wondering if you found anything.
Very curious to hear your theory. I think in terms of if we're looking specifically at the anti-war movements, I think they started getting when you look at the anti-war movement in the 60s, it seemed like the protests started happening in the mid 60s, around 64, 65, but they became much more, there were more people on the streets. There are more people, I think, fighting, and it became more normalized in some ways. By fighting, I mean fighting against war. It's like a sloppy use of terms, perhaps, in this context. But it gained more traction and I think became more normalized as the 60s went on. So towards the later 60s, I feel like the protests were better attended, or protests having hundreds of thousands of people wasn't quite a once in a blue moon event anymore. But that's just, I think, speaking to perhaps it's starting, like that process starting in the realm of where are we wanting to set up boundaries to protect something, and then that perhaps like lending itself or creating a place where we can kind of take off from for the next level, where we're really actually having to devote that endurance and that resilience towards what we're fighting for, which is Saturn and Aries. But I mean, there's a lot more perhaps to say around that. But Chani, I'm curious what you had observed or noticed.
I don't know if it's worth mentioning here, but there's the whole conspiracy theory that what happened to the power of the anti-war movements in the 60s is that it got purposefully diluted with drugs by the government, and everything kind of brought down to like, oh, those crazy hippies. And so that there was a structured kind of invisible resistance or chipping away at what was building to be a really like a major powerhouse. Because I think we have to remember, like, the 60s, for all the reasons that we know and don't remember, but it was such a potent time of collectivism that I don't think had struck globally like it had at that point. So that's one thing, and like just the erosion of it in a sense. But okay, there's so many things. I mean, we could have a podcast about every kind of topic we've pointed to. I do want to make sure that we get to both of your research and maybe circle back around to some of this. I do also just want to say that the three of us have noted every time that especially Mars has made an aspect to the nodes. Mars was square the nodes on October 7th. It was square Pluto in the nodes on October 7th. Oh, no, sorry, it was conjunct the South Node around the October 7th event. And so that was really striking to us. We before October, we were all like, oh gosh, what's going to occur when Mars goes over the South Node? Because it was the first time in a couple decades that it had in Libra, and that the eclipse would follow it. And then we know that from that point, Mars, then the next hard aspect, as we call it, that happened, Mars squared the nodes as the ICJ ruling happened, as South Africa brought a case against Israel to the International Court of Justice. And then Mars will make a conjunction with the North Node in, I don't have the date with me,
it's in May.
I
don't have the exact date with me either, but I think it's
the end of May. It's the end of May. So those are also really pivotal points. Pluto was involved in that first. Well, Pluto was involved in the first one. Pluto is hanging out around the beginning of Aquarius, end of Capricorn. So it was involved in that first one. But I do think that, and then we saw Chiron crossing the North Node, and so just like in your own, for the audience's own astrological witnessing. Just noticing, like when I talk or when the app talks or any astrologer you follow talks about something crossing the North Node, it's usually going to be talking to an event that happened around an eclipse, or something kind of striking about whatever is occurring around eclipses will kind of come forth. Okay. Thea, do you want to bring us into what it is you were looking at?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that I've been following since the ruling in the Supreme Court last June 29th, so this is 2023, there was a decision on the case of Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. And the way the Supreme Court ruled on that basically banned race-based affirmative action in this country. And I was like, what's happening? First of all, just context. Affirmative action, what I realized through doing the research, I was like, oh, I was only born 2 decades after this all came to be, which is so, it just situated me in a moment where I realized how vulnerable most of our civil liberties are. They're quite new, and they get either reaffirmed or struck down via the courts. And so I really was looking at, we have the Supreme Court in the United States. They're a body that, as we know, they're appointed for a lifetime. And this ruling actually happened just before the nodes moved into Aries and Libra, because that happened in July. But we had already had our first eclipse in Aries in the North Node. It was like April 20th, 2023. So the scales to me were like already tipping if we think about that Aries-Libra axis. And I was also thinking about, sometimes with astrology, I just go for the symbolism. I'm like, the term affirmative action to me is so Aries. It's like, we're going to do something here. It's so Aries in relationship to Libra, right? To bring fairness. And so right now, like what's even just happened in the last couple days, it's like, it's in the news again. Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote a long form piece in the New York Times. And it's about this issue of color blindness and affirmative action, and what it means when affirmative action gets struck down because conservative groups who are advocating and do these sort of advocacy lawsuits, they have co-opted a lot of the language that was used in the civil rights to give us liberty. So it's just a really weird echoing of what was like established in the 60s. And now what I feel like is happening is that, what is happening? Affirmative action is no longer a thing. And also, what are we talking about? Like, what is the purpose? I'm really interested in these terms that we have now called diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that what Nicole Hannah-Jones has written, that actually the aim of affirmative action was not to diversify. It was actually to bring fairness and repair. I think you used those words in the beginning of this episode, Chani. And like, what does it mean to do restorative justice when you're in a country that has these legacies of what was really just like racial apartheid in this country? And we know, so now that the language has been co-opted and people are saying it's not fair to base admissions, employment hiring, even things that are actually were established to create safe havens for Black people in this country. So I'm thinking about HBCUs and like what that means to have, like that now it's being tilted against universities like Harvard and saying you can't use race as a factor into admission, when Harvard was established so that Black people could go to college. So, and I said Howard. I may have said Harvard, but I meant Howard University. Correction there. But what I also want to say is that by the time, if you look at what's happening in the astrology in 1968 to 1969, I think the nodes by that point, even though the civil rights it was happening in sort of these tiered mechanisms of executive orders and then bills to reinforce, but they really don't. Harvard University doesn't start applying. It's the first schools to start using affirmative action in 1968 for that class that's incoming. So that's when the nodes by that point are in Aries and Libra. And they start to really, like, that's the first incoming class where they apply it. And like Black admission, like jumped. And so I am really interested in like, yeah, the way that that's kind of just being undone in a lot of ways. It's like, we don't need this. We're over this. And so even things that have been, as a Black woman who's given birth and how dangerous that is in this country, it's like incredibly dangerous, that there are certain programs put in place to protect women or people who are giving birth. And those programs are now under attack. So it has wide implications, and it's something that I'll be following through the eclipse season for sure.
Yeah, I know this because elders have always said this, and Angela Davis literally wrote the book on it, but freedom is a constant struggle. I've been so struck by that, about looking back at the history, and it's like all of this is new and all of this is already being eroded, and all of this was so hard to get in the first place, and nobody was able to rest on their laurels. They've never been. This is just something we should assume, that everything will have to be forever and a day fought for and protected. And I'm so struck also by affirmative being so Libran, and then action being so Aries, and those connections there. That's really wild.
I'm just struck by the parallels in the time period, and also thinking that, that time, like when you look at the civil rights movement in the 60s, it's not like it happened in a year or two. And I think we can get really tunnel vision and focused on what's going on right now. But if you reflect on just the last 4 years, like how, or more than 4 years, but I think it's really reached a pivot point, or more pivot points in the last, let's say, 5 or so years, around the murder of George Floyd, and just like not only the rise of Black Lives Matter, but the, again, almost like the normalization of that being like you could walk down the street and you see BLM as a sign, and people know what that means. Like, I don't know that was as normalized, or as, I don't want to say universal, but as let's say, as common before the murder of George Floyd and before all that happened in 2020. And that was only 4 years ago. That wasn't even 4 years ago. And that also linking to eclipses that happened. But if you just reflect on, like, we're talking about a time period in the 60s that spans about 6 years. And I can really see that we are in a comparable time. We've reached certain flashpoints of like, this cannot, of this feeling stewing among people, that this cannot get worse, that we have to turn this around, or there's just nothing good on the other side. And so I think that we've reached that pivot a few times, but I think, like you're both saying, there can be, I guess what I'm speaking to is just the level of protest on the part of the people. But what we're seeing is then the reactionary response from government, or from the Supreme Court, or from the Saturn figures in this equation. So I'm just sitting with that too, just the parallel between these broader time frames. And when I hear you say something like freedom is a constant struggle, it seems so true, and it seems so exhausting. And I just I think that that's maybe where also, there's no planet that's purely negative or positive. And I think the boon of Saturn, the gift of Saturn that we really need right now is that endurance and that resilience, and just that staying power. But that's easier to say.
And I do think that it's exhausting in a world that is built on individualism. And that's the point. They're trying they're trying to separate us and exhaust us one at a time. And that if we actually truly live in a collective kind of way, speaking of Saturn and Pisces and Neptune and Pisces, and this kind of like heavy, on one hand, heavy Piscean signature, we're remembering, and then with Pluto and Aquarius, which often does speak about the group, is that we're trying to like get, I think a lot of, especially leftist activists are trying to remember, like reconnect with the fact that we have to come from a paradigm of collectivism, because that means that not one of us individually is responsible for making this change, that collectively we hold each other together accountable in love, in solidarity, we feed each other, we nourish each other. Like, you can't be in this moment and be active in the resistance to settler colonialism and not get your daily dose of love and nourishment and connection. You will perish. And that's the point. And so it's like, how do we also remember and tap into? And for a lot of us, we have to learn, like, how do I do solidarity? How do I do something that is much more communal and much less about my own kind of personal drive or dream or what have you?
That seems like a good note to conclude on, but by all means, keep going.
Too bad. You have stuff to share. But also, I don't know if we want to include this in the episode, but because I don't have the actual facts and data, but I was thinking a lot about Venus and Mars going over Pluto in Aquarius, and that being a really like important thing to pay attention to. And I did notice like somebody, getting up at a Google meeting and protesting, Google software being used for the genocide in Palestine, and how like war and tech and all of these things intersect, and also activism against it. And then I was also thinking about the recent, atrocities in terms of healthcare and reproductive rights and IVF and all of that. And I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but I feel like it was part of Venus's crossing over Pluto, but I could be wrong. Okay. Well, we can leave that.
Yeah.
Okay. So Eliza, do you want to share your research with us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this needs to take lots of time. I just think it's another striking parallel to draw. And one thing I do want to mention, it's funny because at the beginning of this episode, you did open by naming the the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 60s as being one of these defining moments, and one of the defining moments of that epoch, like of that decade. And what I would say is, just so we don't miss it, we are in a whole sign square right now between Uranus and Pluto. So it is, when planets come together in a conjunction, that's obviously very notable because it's a merging of these two energies. And when there's such slow moving planets like Uranus and Pluto, it happens so rarely. But also when they reach these pivot points of the square and the opposition, we can also see those are called hard aspects, and they can also bring waves and like, let's say, again, I'm going to use the word injection, like injections of energy that kind of feel comparable to that conjunction. So we are in that moment now, if we're thinking whole sign, because Uranus is in Taurus and Pluto is in Aquarius, even though they're at different areas of that sign, but those signs rather. But this is a segue to just to talk about, some of the space race / arms race conversations that have worked their way back into the media. And I do sometimes feel like mainstream media is just an interesting canary in the coal mine for some of these patterns, because when headlines start reappearing that we haven't really seen in a couple of decades, it is always striking. And one of those headlines that caught my attention was, I forget exactly what it was. It was the New York Times, but like space race quietly unfolding. And so what had happened is that in February, I think this was the exact date, was February, was it 24th? February 22nd, we had the Odysseus landing. So Odysseus, that was the first, to my knowledge anyway, it's the first landing on the moon that was orchestrated by a private company. So this was by, I think they're called Imaginative Machines. I might be getting that wrong. But this is alarming if we just imagine the potential of capitalist interests literally colonizing outer space. Like that's quite worrying. But that aside, this is happening. So that happened in February. This is happening just months before we experience, in my opinion, one of the most notable transits of the year, which is a conjunction between Jupiter and Uranus and Taurus. So Jupiter is the planet that relates to expansion. It's quite, like, I think this is actually quite a thrilling conjunction, and it's not necessarily a one that we need to be a little worried about, but it does have ramifications. So Jupiter relates to expansion, to growth, also to wisdom. And Uranus is the planet of disruption. It's the planet of technology and just like defiance and defying the status quo and what we conceive of being possible. So when these two things come together, it does seem like what was previously considered impossible suddenly becomes it's suddenly happening. So we talked about this in our year ahead episode. So if people want to go back and listen to that overview that we did, they can do so. I think that would actually be the episode that immediately precedes this one, if you're looking at them in order. But we talked about the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that's going to happen this April. And we relate it back to a previous Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which actually happened in the sign Libra. So this one's happening in Taurus, again, just to clarify. But a previous one happened in Libra in 1969 on the day of the moon landing. And like, to my own amusement, the moon was also in Libra, crossing Jupiter and Uranus at that time. And so it's just interesting to me that as we have Jupiter and Uranus co-present in the same sign, really only separated by a handful of degrees because they are such slow-moving planets, even though the conjunction is happening in April, they're still pretty close together. We're again getting like news headlines around moon landings. It just seems quite striking. And then, the moon landing itself was precipitated by a decades of basically the US versus the USSR in terms of like trying to be the first person out the gates or the first country out the gates to for lack of a better word, colonize the moon or to colonize outer space, to literally set the flag into the earth of the moon.
Only men
and
do that.
Oh, indeed. Only superpowers too. And what was striking to me with that, so we had, one of the major pivot points when I think of the space race was actually the Sputnik launch, which happened in 1957. The moon landing, the US moon landing, happened 12 years later. It was actually the exact Jupiter return from the Sputnik launch. And now we're again having this, again, it's in a different sign, but we're still having this very similar combination of energies that is coinciding with not only lunar landings by private companies and just like, when is Amazon going to colonize Mars? Like, these are questions that I'm having. But somewhat facetiously, but I think you know what I mean. But also what we're seeing is like with this, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and because Russia is run by, to underestimate severely, he's not a democratic leader. He is a dictator, essentially. We are coming back into a period where suddenly the relations between the U.S. and the former Soviet Union, the U.S. and what is now Russia, not the Soviet Union, are really mirroring what they were in the Cold War. And we're seeing this also just with regards to like the International Space Station, which was set up as a means, I think, in some ways to put an end to the space race, to say this is a place where it's the International Space Station. So there's going to be a representative from the Soviet Union at that time. Actually, no, then it was Russia. And a representative from the US and a representative from these other countries. Well, the International Space Station is actually, Russia has announced that they no longer want to continue with it. They want to do their own thing. So some of these news reports around the space race that's unfolding are suggesting that, first of all, China is light years ahead of anything, and we haven't been fully clocking that. And then China might actually be collaborating with Russia in some way. And long story short, there are just, again, these questions of who, for people not watching the video, I have scare quotes, who's going to own space first? And obviously, we don't want anyone to own space, but it's just, again, startling to me that these are conversations we're having, that these are anxieties that are being reported in national newspapers, and the stakes seem really high, because the scale is so large and the ambitions people have are so ugly.
Yeah. And you said this, but just to highlight again, in the mid-60s, Jupiter was also in Taurus and then going to go into Gemini. And we're in that moment here too. So it's like another really stark and a parallel. We're headed into, very shortly, I consider, Eliza, you went over this a little bit, that when the eclipses and their impact, so we can feel it a couple weeks before, a couple weeks after. I definitely think that once the sun enters the sign that one or both eclipses are going to happen in, it's like on, because that's like the swath of sky that is going to, be activated. And because both of these eclipses happen and occur within Aries season, within the sun's traveling through that sign, that it's a little bit more compact even than it was last eclipse season, because that was over the span of 2 different areas. So everything's going to occur within Aries season, although the nodes will continue to be activated. I do want to say that in the middle of the eclipses, so the first one's on the 25th of March, and that is the second eclipse in Libra that we will have. And then the second one is April 8th, and that will be the second eclipse in Aries that we will have. And so those are the 2 eclipses. March 19th, the sun moves into Aries, and then eclipse season is on, because that's where the sun will be when both of these eclipses happen. But even on March 18th, Mercury goes over the North Node in Aries. And so it feels like even on the 18th, we really start to hear a lot of what's going to occur. Now, Mercury stations retrograde in Aries on April 1st. And I've been kind of watching, Mercury is already in Aries as we're filming this. And Mercury in Aries is ruled by Mars. Mars, again, is a planet that loves to do conflict and definitely loves to get attention because of what it pokes at. Now, Mars currently is in Aquarius, making a square to Uranus. It's still close to that square it did a couple of days ago. And so while Mars is doing that right now, the things that Mercury is talking about are upsetting, and they're something that is like a big change. And so over the last 24 hours, there was an announcement that there will be a TikTok ban in 6 months, which will be the next eclipse season, if the company doesn't sell. And then I don't trust any tech company but ours, because I just don't trust. Why would I trust a tech company? Social media platform, any of it? Like, I think all of them are, have nefarious underpinnings. But a lot of people are saying, well, isn't it interesting that if pro-Palestinian content and education is one of the biggest things on TikTok, that our US government would want to move towards banning it? Am I saying that I trust TikTok? No, I don't at all. I totally whatever. But I also think I don't trust our government either. And that is an interesting thing that is also related to the eclipses, because Mercury is in the sign where the eclipses will happen. It's not quite yet in its pre-retrograde shadow. It will enter its pre-retrograde shadow on April 18th. But I just think that as Mars is still in Aquarius, making that whole sign square to Uranus, that we're going to get more disruptive news. Mars will then enter into Pisces and be in the same sign as Saturn. And that's when things are going to get super sticky, I think. That's when the communications are going to get really hard and laborious, and where things will really be grindy. So Mars enters Pisces on March 22nd. And from then until for sure April 10th, 11th, our communications are going to get really challenged. I think we're going to have a lot of hard topics to move through. And all that to say, the eclipse on April 8th is ruled by Mars, who will be making a conjunction to Saturn, which is one of the most difficult things it can do. So all that to say, over the course of Aries season, I want us all to be taking excellent care of ourselves. It's a very important eclipse season because of what it's commenting on. As part of homework for it, obviously listen to your reading on the Chani app and read your horoscopes and all of that. But I do want you to think about what has transpired over the course of the last 6 months, from October 2023 to now for you. How have world events intersected with your own personal awareness, understanding, growth? How has your own self been activated as an activist? What have you come up against? What has it challenged within you? And then Eliza wrote, gorgeous horoscopes for the oh, sorry, I don't know if that's true. Did you write yeah, you did. You wrote the horoscopes for the nodes. Eliza wrote gorgeous horoscopes for the nodes in Libra and Aries, and they're in the Chani app, and they're also on our website. And I highly recommend that you read yours for your rising sign, because it's a really good kind of like meditation and point of reflection. We've also got some meditations in the meditation section of the app about the nodes. And it's a good time to reread where the nodes were when you were born, I think, just to understand, the parts of our chart where we get activated. But I think all of us always say, like, during eclipse season, sleep more, rest more, pay attention to what is beginning and ending, and know that there's I can't remember how you phrased it, Eliza, but eclipses are power surges. So there's no groundedness to the power, to our source of power. And so we've got to actively supply that for ourselves.
I just want to say I actually don't remember if I wrote those, but they're still worth reading. And thank you to whoever wrote them. And I also want to, just to tie these two ends, because I do find them really fascinating with the TikTok. We've been talking about anti-war movements, and it is so fascinating that TikTok can be levied as this, as a mobilizer, and especially a mobilizer of young people. And I think what we're seeing is that in the 60s, obviously, it had a very different form. And one way that's taken form in recent years has been TikTok, and the boycotts come to mind, like the anti-Starbucks boycott, anti-McDonald's. But then there's also the Kellogg's boycott, which I don't think has as much to do with boycotting companies that are supporting the Israeli military, but the Kellogg's CEO or whoever it was that said we should all eat cereal for breakfast if inflation is too much to eat other things. So anyway, I guess one of the main thing I'm pointing to is in this context of speaking about resistance and speaking about mobilization, I do, we kind of mentioned TikTok at the very end there, but I actually think that's crucially important. And it in some ways comes full circle to everything we've been talking about, because it is one of these means of mobilizing in this era of Pluto and Aquarius, of increased technology, of technology being used as a tool of resistance, and that being a threat to people in power. But that's not adding to your homework.
I mean, I think the other, in addition to the eclipse homework, is just to reflect on if Saturn and Pisces is also maybe activating it at an angular house or an important planet or point for you, or just to see where that is. Just because it does feel at once, Eliza, you always say the word leaky, but it can be I don't know, kind of a connective point. We can connect in a way that we can the shortcut is just how can we manifest our ideals? Even if the rubber meets the road when Mars conjunct Saturn, and that's hard just after 2 eclipses. But there's still a way to bring it forth. And Chani, I know you speak a lot about that in the readings, and people should definitely reflect on that. Their weekly readings, their quarterly readings, there's so much there for people to reflect on too.
Yeah. And just really knowing what area of your life, what house in your chart contains Aries and Libra, and digging into those houses and the themes of them, and really seeing the kind of varying ways that this will show up. Because sometimes eclipses kind of blot something out in our life, and sometimes that's us. Sometimes we're oh, I kind of went missing for that week, or something took me out, or something obstructed me, because it is a literal kind of obstruction. And then sometimes it's more of an activation. Eliza, you were saying a lot, that surging kind of energy that wakes us up and startles something in us or in that area of our life. So I think it's empowering, or it's at least fortifying, to go into eclipse season knowing what areas of life they're happening for you in, and then just knowing that we're all going through this kind of portal of instability and activation, and a moment that also I think really brings up all of our shadow material collectively, personally. And so when you feel powerless, or I think when I feel powerless in the face of the world, one good place for me to go is with my own personal work and like how can I heal or tend to my own place of inner violence or harm or disruption or bitterness or fear or self-pity or whatever that thing is that's coming up. And then therefore can hopefully at the same time be a better citizen and fellow to the folks that I'm, joining with. So I never want us to get stuck in the personal, but I also don't want us to only be in the collective too. Like this is a real balance, I think. And with this first eclipse being in Libra and talking about balance, it's like, how are you balancing the inner tending with the external tending too, and showing up for both? Because I do think eclipses can bring up some hefty inner stuff that we can kind of like breeze by, more easily, not in eclipse season. And then eclipse season comes and it's kind of like, oh, wow, I've got some work to do. We'll be back to after eclipse season to reflect on how it was for us, how we saw it showing up in the world, and where we kind of go from there. And then also to talk, I think, a little bit more about the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that we are very excited for and looking toward as not a solve, but as something that we're hoping will be innovative and expansive and helpful in some kind of unpredictable way.
Breakthrough.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you back here soon. Bye for now.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.